On July 10th, we unveil the all-new JG9 Studios, the coolest NFL office on YouTube where all future streams will take place. Video drops at 6 p.m. Eastern, and a celebratory live stream drops at 9 p.m. Eastern. And now, on with our feature presentation. This player right here is Chicago Bears quarterback Rudy Bukich. And in 1965, to the surprise of a ton of people, there were very few quarterbacks in football who were better than he was. I don't think anyone saw it coming, seeing as the man was 35 years old, right around the time that most players start to decline, especially back then. And even though Bukich had been in professional football for over a decade by this point, he had done next to nothing, throwing just 31 touchdowns and starting 15 games since entering the league in 1953, and bouncing around a bunch of different teams. But somehow, at the age of 35, almost like what Rich Gannon would do 3.5 decades later, when he came out of nowhere in his mid-30s to become one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL with the Oakland Raiders, Bukich became a household name, played the best football of his career, and guided the Bears to a 9-5 record, of which he started 12 games and went 9-3. He received votes for AP Comeback Player of the Year, finished third in the MVP voting from UPI, only behind Jim Brown of the Cleveland Browns and Gale Sayers of the Chicago Bears, meaning that he got the most votes out of any non-running back. And he did this by throwing 20 touchdowns and just 9 interceptions. To be above a 2-to-1 ratio back then, at a time where it was extremely commonplace for a quarterback to throw more interceptions than touchdowns, that is incredible any way you want to slice it. He threw an interception on just 2.9% of his 312 passes, which was the top total in the league amongst all qualified quarterbacks. And he was near the top of the NFL in just about every single passing category. You name a stat, and Bukich was right up there with the best of them. He was second in passing yards behind John Brody of the San Francisco 49ers. He was fifth in passing touchdowns. He was third in completion percentage at 56.4%, only behind John Brody and Johnny Unitas. And he was third in passer rating at 93.7, only behind those same two aforementioned quarterbacks of John Brody and Johnny Unitas. Truly, it came out of nowhere that Rudy Bukich was now one of the best quarterbacks in football. It would almost be like if this year, considering his age and his NFL credentials up until this point, Blaine Gabbert somehow became one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the league. That's what Rudy Bukich did in 1965, to the shock of just about everyone. But in 1966, oh man, did he come crashing back down to earth. 1 year later, he played like the Rudy Bukich that just about everyone thought he was, or that everyone remembered him being during his previous decade in the NFL, especially during his time with the Pittsburgh Steelers in the early 1960s, and his less than stellar stints as the backup quarterback with the Los Angeles Rams in the mid-1950s. But not only was the 1966 season a disaster for Bukich and the Bears on the field, but off the field for Bukich, it was also a bit of a train wreck. Because after this disaster of a year, at the conclusion of what might be one of the most disappointing seasons in franchise history, Bukich spoke to the press about how the season went. And you're not going to believe what he said, because, and I say this with no exaggeration or hyperbole whatsoever, it might be one of the most delusional and nonsensical comments and evaluations I have ever heard from any player ever. There's a reason this video is so long. Bukich was criticized for these comments back in 1966, from those who remember it nearly 16 years ago. But this is one of those things that, especially with how much of a stranglehold football has on the country today, and with how prevalent sports media is, and social media is, that if Bukich said it today, he would be run out of town. That's how bad it was. Because this is the story behind what might just be considering the circumstances, as I'm broadly gesturing at everything, the most delusional quarterback, the most delusional player, and heck, the most delusional moment period in the over century-long history of the Chicago Bears franchise. Before I talk about the comments made by Bukich and what was so bad about them, because trust me, there's a lot we need to dissect about these comments. We need some context to understand just how the 1966 season was going for the Bears, both from a team perspective and from the perspective of their starting quarterback and their somewhat of a star quarterback now, Rudy Bukich. The year is 1966, and to say that expectations for the Chicago Bears are high would be putting it lightly. Many people expected that the Western Division would be a three-way dogfight between the same three teams that were in the hunt for much of the 1965 season, with those teams being the Green Bay Packers, the Baltimore Colts, and none other than the Chicago Bears. And it made complete sense as to why people were hyping up the Bears. They led the NFL in point differential the previous year at plus 134, and they had an offense that on paper was going to be tough to beat, especially since in 1965, they had the second highest scoring offense in the league, scoring 409 points in 14 games, or just under 30 points per game, which was only behind the San Francisco 49ers for the top total in the league. You had Rudy Bukich under center, who was incredible the previous year, as I've said before. You had Gale Sayers, the best running back in football, who scored 20 touchdowns the previous year and was the reigning AP Rookie of the Year. As a side note, to learn more about just how good Gale Sayers was and how he even joined the Bears in the first place, click the card in the upper right corner. You had Mike Ditka, the best tight end in football, and a man who was named a Pro Bowler in each of his first 5 seasons and received some sort of AP All-Pro nomination, whether it was for the first team or the second team, in each of the past 4 seasons. You had Johnny Morris at wide receiver, a man who was 2 years removed from winning the Triple Crown by leading the NFL with 93 receptions, 1,200 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns. You had fullback Ronnie Bull, a former AP Rookie of the Year winner in 1962, who was an absolute bulldozer and averaged a career-high 4.6 yards per carry the previous year. Basically, there was talent everywhere on this offense. Even though Green Bay was the defending division champion and the defending NFL champion, in the eyes of many people, this was Chicago's division to lose, said the Chicago Tribune in their preview for the 1966 season, in which they had the Bears winning the crown. Why not? It takes very little bravado to forecast a rousing football season for George Halas's Bears, who go into their 47th campaign with visions of playoff sugar dancing through their heads. The Bears appear to have all the ingredients of which championship cakes are concocted. And starting at quarterback, there is Rudy Bukich, who was simply the best passer in the league last season. However, as you've probably been able to tell through these lowlights for the past few minutes, that did not happen. None of that happened. Because even though the Bears were one of the favorites to win it all, and were expected to build off of their 1965 campaign, they did not do that in the slightest bit. The Bears jumped out to an 0-2 start following losses to the Detroit Lions and the Los Angeles Rams, and were unable to recover after that, finishing with a poor record of 5-7-2. The team projected to finish first in their division, they came in 5th place out of 7 teams, as only the Detroit Lions and the Minnesota Vikings were worse off than they were. The team that had what looked like an unstoppable offense on paper and had the second best offense in football in 1965, it was the exact opposite in 1966, as they only scored 234 points, or under 17 points per game. They went from about 30 points per game to roughly half that total. Chicago had the third worst offense in the league, as the only two teams to score fewer points than them over the course of the 14-game season were the Detroit Lions and the Atlanta Falcons. But the Falcons were an expansion team, so they get a pass. The team that had the top point differential in football the previous year, it was in the negatives this year. And Rudy Bukich, the man you've been watching this whole time? Yeah, let's talk about Rudy. As great as the 1965 season for him was, where you could actually make a legitimate argument that he was the best quarterback in the league, or at the very least, a top three man alongside John Brodie and Johnny Unitas, the 1966 season was a train wreck for him, where he regressed super hard and played like one of the worst quarterbacks in the league. After throwing 20 touchdown passes in 1965, despite starting 2 extra games in 1966, that number was cut in half to just 10. After throwing 9 interceptions and taking great care of the football in 1965, he threw a whopping 21 interceptions in 1966, which was tied with Randy Johnson of the Atlanta Falcons for the third worst total in football. After throwing a pick on less than 3% of his passes in 1965, he threw an interception on 6.8% of his passes in 1966, which, amongst all qualified quarterbacks, was the third worst total in the league, only ahead of Johnny Unitas and Randy Johnson. After a touchdown-to-interception ratio better than 2-1 in 1965, which was really good, it was the inverse in 1966, as with 10 touchdowns and 21 interceptions, the ratio was worse than 1-2, which is really bad. After completing 56.4% of his passes in 1965, which was the third best completion percentage in the league, he completed just 47.6% of his passes in 1966, with his percentage dipping by nearly a full 10 points. Among all 13 qualified quarterbacks in the NFL, this ranked 11th, only ahead of Norm Snead of the Philadelphia Eagles and Randy Johnson of the Atlanta Falcons, who I've talked about a lot in the last few minutes. So if you want to learn more about him, seeing as he had quite the bizarre career, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And perhaps most embarrassing for Bukich in all of this, from a statistical perspective, was his passer rating. Remember how he had a rating of 93.7 in 1965, which was third in the NFL and was really, really good? In 1966, that percentage was just about cut in half. During the 1966 season, Rudy Bukich mustered up a passer rating of 49.3. Among 18 qualified quarterbacks, this ranked 15th in the league, or 4th from the bottom, and it was well below the league-wide average of just under 68. For some perspective on just how bad Bukich was at throwing the football in 1966, the number 1 quarterback in the league that season was a man on Chicago's division rival and their biggest rival, Green Bay Packers quarterback Bart Starr. Bart Starr threw 251 passes that season. Let's say that we continue the 1966 season, and Starr threw another 323 passes, so more than double what he actually threw that season. And let's say in this hypothetical that all 323 of those passes fell incomplete. So Starr was 0 for his last 323 at completing a pass. He still would have finished the 1966 season with a higher passer rating than Rudy Bukich. That's how bad Bukich was that year. His play for Chicago was ugly with a capital U, and he was a huge reason, and maybe the main reason, why the Bears were so disappointing in 1966. For some even more perspective on how bad Bukich was, because trust me folks, he was really, really bad. I've said many times on this channel before that a quarterback's passer rating would be higher if he did nothing but spike the ball to the ground on every single play. The passer rating of a quarterback who does nothing but throw incomplete passes is 39.6, which is painfully low, but at least he didn't throw an interception. Obviously, it should go without saying, but if your passer rating is lower than 39.6, you really stunk out there. You absolutely cost your team, and you hindered your offense tremendously. Well, in 1966, the Bears played 7 road games. In those 7 road games, Rudy Bukich had a passer rating below 39.6 in 5 of them. That's right. Only twice away from Wrigley Field did Bukich actually have a passer rating better than if he did nothing but spike the ball to the ground on every single play. And in 2 meetings against Green Bay, Bukich threw no touchdowns, 5 interceptions, posted a combined passer rating across the games of 17.5, and led the Bears to just 6 total points. When the lights shine brightest, Bukich faltered tremendously. In 1965, Rudy Bukich was an MVP candidate. In 1966, Rudy Bukich was borderline unplayable. In 1965, quarterback was the least of Chicago's concerns. In 1966, quarterback was their biggest concern. So I think it's safe to say that it was a rough season for the Chicago Bears, and especially for Rudy Bukich, who considered retiring at one point and even feuded with his coaching staff during the season. Said Bukich after one loss to the Los Angeles Rams in Week 2, "A team gets a certain attitude about a game and a season under a certain regime. We haven't been right since training camp. I've put as much thought and effort into the game plan as possible, but it just hasn't come out right. Way to throw your coaching staff under the bus." And now, after the season was finally done, with the year ending on a high note with a 41-28 victory over the abysmal Minnesota Vikings, a small consolation prize, it was time for Rudy Bukich to evaluate the season. It was time for him to face the music, talk to the press, and look back at the 1966 campaign, which I think anyone would say was an objective failure. What would you expect most players to say in this situation? You would expect something like, "This was an extremely disappointing year, and we're going to be determined to make things right in 1967. You would expect something like, "I'm disgusted with how I played. I know I can do better, and my teammates deserve better, and they're going to get better next year." You would expect something like, "We thought we had the talent and the pieces to do it, but we just couldn't get it done, and we've got to find a way to make it work next year." Anything along those lines would work, and let's be honest, be a complete non-story. But oh no, that is not what Rudy Bukich said. That's not what Bukich, in all his delusion, said. Because he said just about the dumbest thing possible, and it's so dumb that I'm going to say the entire quote at once before dissecting it piece by piece. Because trust me, there's a lot to break down here. Bukich didn't say that the 1966 season was a bad one. He said it was, in all honesty, a pretty good year. No hint of sarcasm or joking whatsoever. He truly meant it. And it wasn't because of young talent that developed, or because the team played better toward the second half of the year, or because the chemistry improved tremendously. Get ready for this. Said Bukich, "We lost 2 games we definitely should have won. The Detroit opener and the 49er game out there in San Francisco. Plus the recent Colt game, the one we were winning 16-14 with a few minutes to go. If we made a first down and controlled the ball the last few minutes, we'd have won. So we would have finished 8-6. Close to last year, right? Not too far off the mark, really. I'm sorry, what? Okay, there is a lot to break down here, because as dumb as you might think that comment is, and trust me, it's dumb, I promise you, when we add some more context to it, it's going to get a heck of a lot dumber. The logic, if you can even call it that, is that even though the Bears went 5-7-2, 3 of those losses were games that they should have won. Take 3 of those losses away and make them wins, and you've got a team that finishes 8-4-2, which is still a worse record than what they had in 1965, and wouldn't have even gotten them close to competing for the division title and the playoffs. But even though it's worse, it's close enough. So it actually was a fine season. What's that saying about close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades? You lost all those games. You freaking lost those games. That's not how this works. You can't just say that a season was good because you could have won games that you didn't. Imagine if I try to argue that this was a good year for me academically, even though I finished with a 2.3 GPA, and last year I had a 3.5. I say that, well, there were 3 subjects that I could have done better in, but I didn't. However, if I did what I was supposed to do there, then my GPA would have been 3.3, which is close to what it was last year. So that's pretty good. You get why that logic makes no sense, right? You can't just say that a season is good because you won a hypothetical game. This just in, I'm one of the most popular YouTubers on the platform. Move over, Mr. Beast. I had 3 videos that I know could have gotten 20 million views, even though they didn't. But if we pretend hypothetically that they did, then who knows how good I'd be. Plus, just the audacity for the quarterback, who's played terribly all season, and who was the main reason for the team's failure to say this, is absolutely insane and flat out insulting to everyone involved. Why is everyone so upset about how the season went? It went really well. The players are upset because the team played poorly. The fans are upset that they spent their hard-earned money and their time on this team. And here you are, trying to console them that the season was actually pretty good, even though you were the #1 reason why it was an objective failure, and maybe the most disappointing season in the nearly half-century-long history of the franchise at the time. It's almost like if I hit an 8-year-old dog with my car, and the dog dies, and I try to console the owner by saying, the dog lived a heck of a life. He should have lived another 3 more years, and if he did, then he would have been close to living what the average dog lives, which is pretty good. You get why that's bad, right? But hang on a second, because we're not done yet. You're not going to believe this. Let's look at that quote again. Bukich said, "We lost 2 games we definitely should have won. The Detroit opener and the 49er game out there." Now, I absolutely hate when people say that we lost a game that we should have won. And if you just count it as a win, we're looking at things differently. Simply because there are so many other variables that you need to consider. However, there are obvious exceptions to the rule. If Scott Norwood hits the field goal at the end of Super Bowl 25 for the Buffalo Bills, the Bills are champions. Duh. If the Hail Mary gets ruled correctly, the Green Bay Packers win that game over the Seattle Seahawks, obviously. So what happened during the game out there in San Francisco, where the Bears lost, that Bukich was so adamant that the team should have won? The Bears lost 41-14. 41-14.
The Chicago Bears are in possession. Rudy Bukich passing to Jimmy Jones in the left flat. As he turns, he drops the ball. Kermit Alexander scoops it up, goes in from the 14-yard line, holding the ball, a loss for the touchdown.
I'm sorry, what? I know I already said that once, but it bears repeating. How can you be that delusional to say that you should have won a game that you lost 41-14, losing by 27 points? And not only that, but if you take that loss and count it as a win, which again was a game that you lost by 27 points, that the season would be better? That's not how this works.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
That's like me saying that the Phoenix Suns should have won Game 7 against the Dallas Mavericks. That's like me saying that the Atlanta Braves in Game 5 of the NLDS against the St. Louis Cardinals back in 2019, when they allowed 10 runs in the first inning, should have won that game. Oh, and I forgot. The game wasn't even that close, because the 49ers led 31-7 at the half, led 41-7 at the end of three quarters, and the Bears only got to 14 because of a garbage time touchdown in the fourth quarter, when the Niners were up by 5 possessions and had nothing to play for. During this game, Bukich got benched after going 3 for 12, completing 25% of his passes for 46 yards, 2 interceptions, and a passer rating of 31.2. During this game, the Bears turned it over 4 times and had just 9 first downs, compared to 25 for the 49ers, with the Niners nearly tripling them in that stat. And during this game, the Niners had 411 yards of total offense, compared to 129 for the Bears. So the 49ers just about tripled Chicago's total output. As for every yard the Bears got, the 49ers got 3. And you're going to tell me, with a straight face, that not only was this season a success, but that this season was a success because you can flip the result of the Bears-49ers game to give the Bears an imaginary win, even though this was a game where you got benched and your team lost by 27 points? Breaking news. The Tennessee Titans should have made the playoffs in 2009 because they absolutely should have beaten the New England Patriots that season. And the same thing applies to the other game that Bukich mentioned, which was the opener against the Detroit Lions. That game was also not close. The Lions won it 14-3 and had an 11-point lead for the entire second half, seeing as your offense didn't score a single point in the second half. And once again, in that game, you played terribly, throwing no touchdowns and 2 interceptions while posting a passer rating of 36. Then again, this was only an 11-point game, which, considering how Bukich somehow thought that they should have been the 49ers, an 11-point game might as well be up there with the Chiefs-Bills playoff thriller as one of the greatest back-and-forth, close affair games of all time. I'm genuinely baffled as to how anyone can possibly think this way, and considering the fact that Bukich never started another game for the Bears after this season, this was his lasting legacy. This was his final impression. His lasting legacy was not his remarkable 1965 season, where he came out of nowhere in his mid-30s to be one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, but rather his 1966 season, where he said what might just be the dumbest thing I've ever heard any player say. And I've been doing this for a while. Just to recap, even though the Bears went 5-8-2, the 1966 season was a massive success. If you take their 21-16 loss to the Colts and change that to a win, take their 14-3 loss to the Lions and change that to a win, and then take their 41-14 loss to the 49ers, which they were losing 41-7 after 3 quarters, and you change that into a win, then boom, you have a team that has 8 wins. And 8 wins is pretty close to 9 wins, which is what the Bears had in 1965. Round that up on a scale from 0 to 10, and you've got a 10-win team. Take the number 10 on a scale of 1 to 14, and round that number up, and you've got an undefeated 14-win team that is one of the greatest teams of all time. The 1966 season was incredible, everyone, And all it took was a little simple math to prove it. Unbelievable. Unfreaking believable. Because in 1966, even though everyone with a working brain thought that the Bears massively underperformed and disappointed, one man did not think that way. One man dared to think different. And that man was Bukich the buffoon. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.